entree into Sunni jihadist circles. Iran is a little bit like the campaign donor who will give money to both presidential candidates. So no matter who wins, the donor will have some influence. And Iran has pursued this strategy elsewhere. I would say that Iran's alliance strategy is more about propagating influence than it is about propagating Islam. In Afghanistan, Iran's policy is in part a function of its rivalry with the United States. Again, by tying the United States down in Afghanistan, that reduces the probability since 9/11 that the United States might turn its military toward Tehran. There's evidence, though, that Iran has provided some support to the Taliban, which in light of wanting to keep down the United States is consistent, but it's also inconsistent insofar as Iran and the Taliban are enemies. They almost went to war in 1998. So the support for the Taliban is suggestive of the realpolitik tenet that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And this cooperation, it appears to be tactical and limited. So why would Iran and the Taliban, two Islamic stalwarts, be at odds with each other? Well, in part, it's a function of rivalry amongst Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Of course, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan are largely Sunni. Iran is largely Shia. And the Taliban enjoyed the support of the Saudis and the Pakistanis. And Iran has long felt threatened by Wahhabism, which is one of the major influences of the Taliban outlook. So what Iran sees is a potential Sunni Wahhabist power center which could challenge the legitimacy of its own claims to leadership of the Muslim world. What this suggests is that Islam is a source of prestige and legitimacy. It increases soft power. And when you have soft power, you can sometimes increase that into hard power influence. For example, you can imagine the benefit of their improved geostrategic position in the Levant. They have assets in Lebanon and Syria, right next to their erstwhile enemy, Israel, largely as a function of their, what is publicly portrayed as their religious credentials. So this seems to be Iran's goal in the Arab world, in the Levant, to build soft power to gain hard power. Another thing that Iran has typically dealt with, and this kind of works against the civilizational argument, this idea that Islam is some kind of monolith. The ethno-cultural divide between Arabs and Persians is something that has vexed the Iranians. And so the extremely vocal, religiously charged support for causes like the Palestinians serves to delegitimize Arab rivals who maybe aren't as forward-leaning in their support to the Palestinians. And this increases Iran's political profile in that region. So Islam for Iran, I think, is largely a means to acquire power for causes and objectives that are more complicated, but which could include faith. They've also cooperated, or tried to cooperate fairly extensively with the United States. They stood aside and let us take care of business in Iraq in 2003, and were quite helpful in coordinating the Northern Alliance operations in Afghanistan. And even as the United States sought to build the new Afghan government, Iran was instrumental in convincing all the parties at the negotiating table in Bonn to make the necessary compromises to form a government. Thereafter, American and Iranian diplomats continued to interact quietly but productively. Iran made the largest single donation at a Tokyo Donors Conference for Afghan reconstruction, $450 million, which was about twice the American contribution, and they delivered on it. On another occasion, at that conference, they sent Treasury Secretary Pahl home to the United States with the message that they wanted to broaden dialogue between Iran and the United States to other issues besides Afghan reconstruction. In other words, Iran was seeking a broader rapprochement. On another occasion, they presented James Dobbins, who is the American ambassador in Afghanistan, with a plan by which Iran would fund, I believe the number was around 25,000 troops, their training under U.S. auspices. They would clothe and feed and house these troops and assist the United States in their training. and this was turned down by the administration. And then finally, it culminated in a May 2003 grand bargain proposal, which is a source of some controversy, but I've done some research on it. I can't go into too many details here. But even people who you do not consider to be close friends or advocates of Iran suggested that the United States missed an opportunity that was worth at least pursuing. Iran, 1 month after the fall of Saddam Hussein, sent to the United States a proposal for comprehensive negotiations through a Swiss diplomat, in which they proposed to cooperate more closely on Al-Qaeda, to fully open their nuclear program, to cease their support for Palestinian terrorist groups, to force Hamas to become a strictly political party. Many of the things that we have long sought, they offered to do in exchange for things as simple as recognition and an assurance that we would not try to overthrow the regime. The Bush administration rejected this out of hand. Now, what's noteworthy about this, for my purposes, is that at a time where Islam was supposedly under siege from the West, invasion in Afghanistan, invasion of Iraq, Islam's self-proclaimed vanguard state saw a comprehensive rapprochement with the great Satan. So some concluding thoughts. I'd like to leave you with 3 final points. Point 1. While we are not surprised when our politicians don't do what they say, we tend to take the rhetoric of other countries as actual indicators of their behavior. In Sheikh's words, professed orthodoxy does not mean assured orthopraxy. In simpler language, just because a country invokes fealty to Islam does not mean that it will put words into practice. We need to stop looking at rhetoric of Muslim actors and look more closely at their behavior. After all, we accept that our own politicians invoke concepts such as freedom and human rights to justify American foreign policy. Scholars of Islam and foreign policy need to more closely examine the nature in which Islam serves a supporting role in foreign policy rather than a causal role. The second point is this. To say that Islam chiefly serves a supporting or legitimizing role is not to say that it can never have causal significance. Again, parallels can be drawn to the West. Concern for human rights and democracy certainly inspire us to action, but it's usually only in cases that coincide with more objective national interests. So it's not necessarily entirely hypocritical when the United States refrains from action to save people despite its rhetoric which upholds democracy and human rights. What is necessary for most leaders is a confluence of objective state interests as well as ideological interests. And I would posit that the same would apply to the Muslim world. One can imagine that intervention in Rwanda or South Sudan would have been more likely had these countries occupied a more important geopolitical space, or had they been more important contributors to the world economy. One might hypothesize that Islam can play a co-causal role. For example, Iran might support the Palestinians because it makes good strategic sense to undermine their geopolitical rivals, but also because, on some level, they fear that Israel threatens Al-Quds. Objective and normative civilizational motives need not be mutually exclusive. But I expect it to be highly unlikely that Islam is a sufficient condition to explain most foreign policies that we see. Third and final point is that individuals' leadership matters, especially in a religion as non-hierarchical as Islam. Iran's foreign policy moderated significantly after the death of Ayatollah Khomeini. We have unfortunately seen the charismatic power of an individual like Osama bin Laden. It's not entirely implausible that someone like that could rise to prominence in a state. Fortunately, he did not have the full resources of a state at his disposal. So, a historical review that suggests that Islam is chiefly an instrument should not make us entirely complacent that at some point in the future, Islam might not emerge as a more prominent driver and cause, because we have seen the significant role that individuals or parties or constituencies can play. So while I think that the discourse about Islam might be a little bit alarmist, we need to recognize, as they say in the stock market, when you buy a stock, that past performance does not guarantee future returns. So with that, I would like to end my remarks, and Elizabeth, can I turn the microphone over to you to introduce? Okay. All right. I haven't.
It's all written in the bulletin.
All right. A little miscommunication here. I was doing the introductions, but John, would you like to come up and introduce yourself and give us your talk? Thank you.